Osaka, Japan. September 1961.
Typhoon Nancy started its long journey forming from a tropical low near the Marshall Islands on September 7, 1961, at a relatively low latitude of 8 degrees north. The relatively small storm gained momentum quickly, and by the time recon first entered the system early on November 9th, Nancy was already a typhoon with a pressure of 978 millibars. Over the next 24 hours, Nancy would then explode in intensity, at times the pressure dropping more than 4 millibars an hour, down to 928 millibars. At this point, it officially recognized Nancy as Category 5 status, and would maintain such status for 5.5 days, the longest stretch officially recognized of any storm on record to this day. It is worth noting that while pressure fixes on Nancy were likely accurate throughout the storm, erroneously high winds reports, some as much as 200 knots, were reported throughout the storm's life and should not be reported as accurate. Nancy would continue to strengthen at a slower rate as it passed just north of Micronesia and south of Guam, taking a generally west track before making a gradual swing northwards. Nancy would strengthen below 900 millibars on September 11th, and following multiple pressure fixes in the high 880s and low 890s on the 12th, Nancy would reach its peak pressure intensity as recon measured an 882 millibar fix at 830Z on September 13th. After peaking in pressure, Nancy would turn more sharply northwards towards Japan. Nancy, now a much larger storm, now turned northeast, missing Kyushu before making landfall over Maruto Shikoku before striking Honshu a few hours later, causing great devastation across the nation. Nancy would ride up the east side of Japan, striking Hokkaido before finally turning post-tropical.
Nancy's strongest landfall was on the Amami Islands when it was still a strong Category 4 with 150 mph winds and a pressure of 918 millibars, one of the deepest storms to strike the islands. By the time it reached the main 4 islands of Japan, it was a Category 3 and weakening, but still an incredible storm in terms of its surge that it brought in, heavy rainfall and strong winds battering the coast. Its storm surge pushed many large ships ashore and caused serious issues in coastal regions. 202 were killed by this storm in total. It caused $500 million in damages, but the actual buildings damaged and destroyed were very high in number. 386,000 damaged and 499,000 destroyed, which is up there in the top few percent. Additionally, this storm was also very harmful in the sense of injuries, 4,972 on the books of injured. Additionally, it was a significant rainmaker, not the most wettest storm, but still produced over 10 inches of rain, 255 millimeters. Nancy's extreme strength at peak, its still very strong stature at landfall, and its damages that ensued across Japan earns its spot at number 10 in my top 100. Long Key, Florida, September 1935. A tropical depression formed in the late days of August in the western Atlantic and became a tropical storm as it pushed through the Bahamas and then continued to strengthen rapidly as it ended up towards the Florida Keys, reaching Category 5 status and then sweeping through the Central Keys and then off the western Florida coast, weakening to a Category 1 by the time it got to the Bend area, and then moving inland towards the northeast, where it re-intensified as it emerged off the coast of the mid-Atlantic and became a hurricane once again for a brief time before turning post-tropical. This, of course, being the Labor Day hurricane of 1935, an extremely well-known storm for numerous reasons. One of those reasons was the sheer strength of the storm, with estimated top wind speeds of 185 miles per hour and an estimated pressure at landfall of 892 millibars, which makes it one of the most intense landfalling storms on record. Even beating storms like Patricia in recent years and almost every other storm out there in the world. 892 millibars at landfall. Of course, the damage was also astronomical as well for the areas that it impacted. The landfall location was probably on the eastern side of Long Key, with the damage, complete damage, being reported as far west as Marathon and as far east as Islamorada and Tavernier to the northeast there. As you can see on this graphic that we compiled, a few little points of interest there where we try to establish just how strong this storm actually was. 913 millibars was recorded as the storm was making landfall on Long Key, probably to the western side of the island before the barometer failed, was taken by the winds and the surge probably. So it probably went lower after that. There was another report of 906 millibars somewhere on that island, but we don't really know where. And the 892 millibar recording is actually not an actual recording, it's an extrapolated readout from a visual perspective when someone was basically reading the barometer and it went off the barometer's scale. So it was, and looking at how close these pressure points are, it's fair to suggest that this storm might have been a little bit weaker than what the official numbers are at 892 millibars. Not to discount the damages that the storm did. It did make landfall. A ship 8 hours before the storm struck recorded a pressure of 920 millibars in the eye, so it intensified all the way and probably started weakening from this point forward. Who knows, maybe it strengthened just a little bit more off the sparsely populated Everglades. Then it continued northwards, of course, as we know. In total, this storm caused 600 fatalities, which is a very high number for a US hurricane. It destroyed at least 100 buildings, although we don't really know actual numbers, and it injured 124. Of course, after this storm, a monument was built to commemorate the Labor Day hurricane, one that I've personally visited, and this storm was known to have caused at least $6 million in damages, although it was probably much higher than that. The railway, of course, which was in use at the time, was never used again after the event. Some of the remnants of the railway line that extends all the way across the Keys are still visible today, but it never actually got reused, unfortunately. That was the Labor Day hurricane, a really immense hurricane in Atlantic Basin history and the strongest landfalling storm in Atlantic Basin history, and it's up there with one of the strongest storms, I think it's third strongest storm in the Atlantic Ocean, period. Number 9 on my top 100. Gulfport, Mississippi, August 1969. A tropical low was seen near the Lesser Antilles and entered the eastern Caribbean in August, and eventually it became a tropical cyclone just when it got to the other side of Jamaica, becoming a tropical storm near Grand Cayman named Camille. It continued northwestwards and rapidly intensified on 2 different occasions as it passed Cuba and became a powerful Category 5 storm, and then slammed into the Gulf Coast of the United States near its peak intensity. The storm then moved inland, curved towards the east, and then became a tropical storm as it exited the United States in the mid-Atlantic region and turned towards the northeast and became extratropical later on. Hurricane Camille is one of the household names of hurricane history, with its extraordinary where buildings were smashed to pieces and flattened for miles around, and the impacts, there were large and smaller boats that were swept inland a number of miles after the storm swept through. Camille was an extremely impactful storm for that region. Thankfully, it could have been worse despite what already happened. If it did move just slightly to the west, it would have struck New Orleans city itself, which was impacted so badly by Betsy the few years before. Camille's impacts weren't just limited to the US Gulf Coast though. Rainfall issues really became a problem in the mid-Atlantic region, Virginia particularly. That's where the highest rainfall from the storm's entire track was seen, 27 inches. And in Mississippi, the highest rainfall amounts got to about 10 inches as it moved through there fairly quickly.
Sunday morning, August 17, 1969. A date that will be long remembered by the residents of the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Out of the night, Hurricane Camille, the most turbulent and destructive storm ever recorded in the Western Hemisphere, came ashore from the Gulf of Mexico. As the sun rose on Sunday morning, this was the battered scene.
From a Gulf Coast point of view, this storm was probably the hurricane of the century. With its remarkable intensity at 175 miles per hour, it caused at least 259 fatalities, which to be honest is slightly low. It shows how good preparations were. Damages totaled $1.4 billion, at least 8,000 buildings damaged and 32,000 destroyed, although I imagine that number is actually much higher. Camille was an extraordinary, impactful storm event, one of which hasn't been seen really before or since for this particular area, certainly not at its intensity. Sure, we've had storms that came close, and obviously Katrina caused worse impacts even though it wasn't as strong, but in terms of sheer strength and might, Camille is certainly the most destructive for the Gulf Coast. That's why it's number 8 in my top 100. Barbados, October 1780. This is the oldest storm that we've got on the entire hurricane week, and it started in the eastern part of the Atlantic most likely. This is not it's an accurate track, it's just an idea of what it may have done since it was so long ago, becoming a category 5 and then swept through Barbados, St. Lucia and the rest of the Lesser Antilles before continuing northwestwards towards Puerto Rico, passing between the Mona Passage between Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic, possibly making landfall on one side or the other before moving northwards and then curving out towards the northeast, passing relatively close to Bermuda as a large category 2 probably. It continued out to sea towards the northeast and most likely turned extratropical. That's really just a mock-up of the track of this storm, which is not fully known as we've already explained. But this storm ranks so highly on our top 100 because of how legendary it was in a historical perspective, even looking back at it today. It probably reached wind speeds of approaching 190 miles per hour. Wind gusts were reported to be at least 200 miles per hour when it made landfall on the Barbados in mid-October. At least 4,500 died on that island, and in Martinique it was even worse, with reported numbers of fatalities there at 9,000. There were lots of fatalities at sea and on ships. The waters in this region were quite active. There had been quite a few wars around about this area in the last year or two, and there was lots of shipping traffic on the British Islands, French and Dutch. So a lot of carnage was wrought by this storm, not just near the islands and on shore, but also out at sea as well. And it's probably several thousand were killed at sea. Along with the extremely dangerous winds was a crushing storm surge of estimates of up to 25 feet, which would be a near record in the basin, if not an actual record. And at least 6,000 were killed in St. Lucia from the storm as well. In total, the death toll is probably 26,500, the deadliest Atlantic storm in history. It damaged at least 56 buildings and destroyed at least 15,000. That's all we really know about this great hurricane, and even though it's a little bit shorter and less on content than the others, it still is recognized absolutely as number 7 on my top 100. Cancun, Mexico, October 2005. A tropical disturbance was lingering around the central Caribbean Sea, struggling to get itself together until it got closer to the western part of Jamaica, which experienced quite a bit of rainfall in the initial days of this tropical cyclone. It became a depression and then Tropical Storm Wilma, and then on the 17th and 18th of October it embarked upon a very rapid intensification phase, going from 982 millibars to a record-setting 882 millibars in 30 hours. It continued northwestwards as a Category 4 after weakening an Iowa replacement cycle or two, then made landfall on Cozumel and then into the Cancun area, before moving northeastwards through Florida as a Category 2 or 3, depending on which part of Florida, initially making a Category 3 landfall and re-strengthening as it left the coast, and then ran out to sea at a real high speed northeastwards and then turned post-tropical. Wilma was an extremely powerful storm, and its appearance during its intensification and peak phase was absolutely mesmerizing. A tiny pinhole eye just a few miles across was the main centerpiece of Wilma near its peak intensity of around 195 miles per hour probably on our analysis, and a central pressure, as we know, of 882 millibars, which could have been just a slight bit lower, maybe by 1 or 2 millibars. The pinhole eye was never going to last forever, but during that period when it was oscillating around the wider dome of the eye itself, or the larger part of the storm I should say, it was really looking fascinating when you look at images up close. It then succumbed, as all pinhole eyes eventually do, and became a much larger eye after an eyewall replacement cycle, continuing northwestwards, and still opened up it with a quite significant looking eye and still a very decent appearance by the time it made its landfalls in Mexico as a mid-range to sort of high-end at times Category 4. After dealing with the Yucatan Peninsula, the storm was still going on quite strong and had ample time to re-strengthen again and claim itself a better appearance once again as it approached the coast of Florida. A little bit of recuperation time for it, and the eye opened out again before it reached Florida, and then it was accelerating a lot more quickly, and that's why it managed to gain some more wind speed up to 115 miles per hour again, and then off towards the northeast as mentioned. Wilma was a massive problem for the coast of Mexico with its surge and with the extremely strong winds. For Florida it was also more of a surge issue rather than the wind, but the winds of course were still extremely powerful down the Keys, up the west coast and up the east coast as well through Lake Okeechobee. Still it got Category 2 conditions. Well, its pressure of 882 millibars, which was detected by Recon, makes it the most intense Atlantic hurricane on record, and it's no contest. Really impressive storm intensity, and of course it was a record for the whole Western Hemisphere until it was beaten by Patricia in 2015. Wilma was a beautiful storm. It caused enormous amounts of damage, and it caused masses of evacuations as well in Florida and in western Cuba. All of these factors conspire to reap the damage total from Wilma of $20.3 billion. Only 52 were killed, despite the storm being a really intense, powerful behemoth of a system. So, to be honest, that's a bit of a tribute to the preparations there. And at least 250 buildings were damaged, but we really don't have any information about that. An extremely powerful storm, as mentioned, Hurricane Wilma, number 6 in my top 100. Homestead, Florida, August 1992.
Hurricane Andrew would be a storm that would help cement the notion that one storm can make a season, which it did during the 1992 Atlantic hurricane season. Andrew was one of only 7 storms to form that year, but Andrew would make its mark on that season. Andrew was preceded by a subtropical depression and 2 tropical depressions earlier in the year, before Andrew would finally get designated on August 14th. Andrew would start out as a minimal to moderate tropical storm through most of its life, getting up to about 50 miles per hour on the 18th and hurricane hunters going on the 19th, and finding Andrew's pressure to be very lackluster at 1,015 millibars. Andrew would continue its track north and northwestward and eventually would make a turn towards the west just to the northeast of the Bahamas. By the 22nd, Andrew would flip its notion of being a weak storm on its head, deepening in an incredible 47 millibars en route to its landfall in the Bahamas and into Homestead, Florida on August 24th. Andrew would make a devastating landfall in the Homestead area, going through Florida and would end up out in the Gulf of Mexico, maintaining Category 2, intensifying back to a major hurricane before making another Category 2 landfall in Louisiana. Andrew's impacts in Louisiana were very considerable. However, it is the damage in Florida that gets Andrew on this list. Andrew's damage was catastrophic, to say the least. Houses and homes completely leveled and destroyed, primarily due to the winds. Some testimonies on the ground indicating that it looked like an F3 tornado had gone through the Homestead, Florida area. Nearly every structure in Homestead would be destroyed and damaged beyond use. 90% of all structures in Key Largo would also be damaged or nearly destroyed. What makes Andrew special is its intensity would come under a lot of scrutiny after it had gone through. Initially, Andrew was assessed at 150 miles per hour, and then would be later upgraded to 155 in postseason analysis. However, Andrew's intensity would be challenged later on in 2004 by NOAA meteorologist Christopher Lancy, who would submit a paper suggesting that Andrew was much stronger. The 2013 reanalysis done by NOAA would agree with that assessment, bringing Andrew to a Category 5 storm at 175 miles per hour prior to its landfall in the Bahamas, and bringing it to a upgraded landfall of 165, pressure of 922 millibars. The 922 being the strongest storm since Hurricane Camille to strike the U.S. at that time, and its winds of 165 being the strongest to hit Florida since the Labor Day hurricane of 1935. What also made Andrew so special is it forced the Florida Building Commission to reevaluate its building standards for homes across the state of Florida in the wake of Hurricane Andrew. Most buildings now have to sustain a certain amount of wind due to the impacts that Andrew caused. What makes Andrew special for me on a personal level is it was the first storm that I remember tracking and seeing its impacts from, and would launch my interest into tropical cyclone tracking starting with the 1995 Atlantic hurricane season. So Andrew, definitely a very special storm, which is why it ends up on this list, and it is a storm that was the gold standard for many other hurricanes after to be measured against up until 2005 when Hurricane Katrina would take that title.
Due to Andrew's small size, storm surge was extremely limited in Florida, a very rare occasion of a strong hurricane really having mostly wind impacts, as people have been led to believe over the years. Of course, that's not true for most storms, but with Andrew it actually was, and wind damage was responsible for almost all of the disastrous results as the storm routed itself across southern Florida. Not just winds though. In Louisiana particularly, tornadoes also caused a little bit of damage to some buildings. Andrew set the bar high in terms of the damage tag, $26.5 billion in damages, and was the costliest hurricane until the 2000s. It damaged 206,000 buildings and destroyed 68,000. It killed 65. Hurricane Andrew will certainly be a memorable storm for an extremely long time, Maybe it's been a little bit put in the shade by more recent tropical cyclones, but certainly from a southern Florida perspective, it is still absolutely at the top. Number 5 on our top 100 this year. New Orleans, Louisiana, August 2005.
On a Tuesday evening, August 23, 2005, a tropical depression 12L formed just southeast of the Bahamas. Tropical Storm Katrina was the 11th named storm of the 2005 Atlantic hurricane season and was the earliest 11th named storm of an Atlantic hurricane season until Tropical Storm Kyle of 2020 beat it, forming on August 24th. The newly named tropical storm eventually developed into a Category 1 hurricane and began closing in on South Florida, making landfall in the Miami area.
Katrina then, of course, became an extremely powerful Category 5 hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico and started turning towards the north, which put the Gulf Coast and New Orleans particularly on top alert.
Katrina was a really surreal experience. Obviously, it was devastating. And I was not in New Orleans during the impact of the storm. My family lived across the lake in Mandeville, and before the storm we evacuated to my campus apartment in Baton Rouge. The evacuation took about 6 hours. The trip from my house where I grew up to Baton Rouge is able to be done in under an hour, but for the evacuation we had to travel north to Mississippi before going west and then dropping down south into Louisiana because of the traffic.
When Katrina reached its peak intensity of 175 miles per hour out in the Gulf of Mexico, it became a real threat that this storm might have made landfall as a Category 5 storm. Thankfully, Katrina weakened just a little bit before landfall, and it did start falling apart as it was doing so. So it made landfall as a high-end Category 3 in the end, early on August the 29th. However, it still brought with it a Category 5 storm surge and extremely powerful winds, and we all know what happened next. But before we get to that part, take a look at what Recon captured during the storm as well. They had cameras fitted to the plane so you can see inside the eye of Katrina as they saw it near its peak intensity. They also carried radar imagery, of course, as they always do, but on some occasions they released their radar data to the public as well, and so some of their radar passes were available to see too.
I was glad I wasn't at the house, even though there was no water damage. It was hit by multiple pine trees, piercing the roof and the second floor ceiling, going through bedrooms and things like that. While it was better in Baton Rouge, there were still impacts. We lost power for a long time at my apartment. Thankfully, there were backup generators to provide hallway lighting, and you could find some food places that had generators to get perishable items and things like that. It seemed like everything was going in slow motion after the storm. Obviously, a recovery was not going to be quick, but the days seemed to drag by, as they tend to do when you have no power. But even when power was restored, it seemed like we would never get back to normal, and I don't think we've gotten back to normal since. I remember the smells. The smell of rotting, mildewed drywall is a smell that really burns the nostrils, and unfortunately I've gotten to smell it a few times since Katrina, but that smell always brings me back to 2005. In New Orleans itself, you can still drive through some neighborhoods and see where people just never came back. Either the houses are no longer there and they are empty lots, or there are still some houses with boards up, interspersed with houses that have been repaired and have nice lawns and things like that. You can just point out that's where somebody lived and doesn't anymore. that's where a house once stood and it's no longer there. Another memory I have are the sounds, and I think it goes for everyone that most people know the hum of a generator after a hurricane and the whir of a chainsaw. But the sounds of the helicopters, even in Baton Rouge, just near my apartment was the basketball arena, and that was being used as a triage hospital. And so there would be Black Hawk helicopters from the Army and National Guard landing and taking off at all times of day, bringing evacuees, bringing supplies, and even doctors. While New Orleans still bears the scars of Katrina, and the fears that it generated still play in our minds, it's no longer a part of our daily lives. We see the memorials, we remember how things were, but we've moved on, and I think that's the most important thing. And I think we've moved on to be more vigilant and to take more precautions in the face of storms.
In New Orleans, levee failures caused massive areas of the city to be flooded with feet, and even some areas completely inundated with water up to the roofs. In Mississippi, the storm surge pushed in and caused substantial damage along the coast, with areas flattened by the storm, with its strong winds and its storm surge combination together, causing really incredible damage along parts of the coastal regions and even extending inland. In the end, it was estimated that storm surge reached up to 16 feet and extended in some places up to 6 miles inland, causing serious structural integrity issues where people were trapped inside buildings.
I really don't think that there have been really any tropical cyclone or pretty much any natural disaster that has had the cultural impact that this storm has. I think it really all boiled down to how shocking it was to see such an unimaginable humanitarian catastrophe unfold in a place that was relatively developed as a major city in the United States in 2005. And there is a lot of controversy surrounding how the authorities were preparing for and how they ultimately responded to this disaster. And it's one of the big reasons why 17 years later, it's still a very emotionally charged subject for many people.
All things considered, this storm was an absolute disaster. It caused 1,964 fatalities, at least $104 billion in damages, damaging at least 100,000 buildings and destroying at least 10,000. Those numbers are probably all higher. Just like Nelson's story, many other people went through this storm. It affected millions of lives, and in some places, as mentioned, in some places, some people didn't return. Katrina's mark is still felt in some parts of New Orleans, and that's why we've put it at number 4, not just for the lasting impact, but for what happened at the time in my top 100. Rockport, Texas. August 2017.
5 years ago, millions of lives would be changed forever in the wake of Hurricane Harvey. To understand more, let's rewind back to Harvey's beginnings. Hurricane Harvey started out as a minuscule tropical wave off Africa in mid-August 2017, slowly developing over the next few days as it moved due west towards the Windward Islands, eventually attaining the name Harvey on August 17th. On August 18th, Harvey made 2 landfalls in the islands of Barbados and St. Vincent as a 45-mile-an-hour 1001 millibar tropical storm. On the 19th, unfavorable conditions led to Harvey degenerating back into a tropical wave as it entered the Caribbean. Little did anyone know, the worst from Harvey was still yet to come. Entering increasingly favorable conditions once in the Bay of Campeche, Harvey would degenerate back into a tropical storm on August 23rd. Then on August 24th, Harvey reached hurricane strength. Continuing to rapidly strengthen as it neared Texas, Harvey peaked late at night at Category 4 intensity on August 25th, with 130-mile-an-hour winds and minimum central pressure of 937 millibars, soon thereafter making landfall over San Jose Island, Texas at 10 p.m. Central Standard Time. After moving inland, Harvey slowed down and stalled for 2 days, eventually moving and entering back into the Gulf of Mexico on August 28th. On August 30th, Harvey made its fifth and final landfall near Cameron, Louisiana, as a 45-mile-an-hour tropical storm with a central pressure of 991 millibars. By September 2nd, Harvey would finally dissipate. 5 years on, the scar left by Harvey still remains in Texas, with bare slabs left of what were once thriving businesses, trees left disfigured due to the intense, long-duration Category 4 winds at its landfall, to the many abandoned cars and homes from Harvey's catastrophic flooding throughout the greater Houston area. Hurricane Harvey is certainly a storm that will be remembered for many, many years to come, and certainly a storm that I personally won't forget anytime soon.
Before it made landfall, Harvey reached its peak intensity with a maximum sustained winds of 130 miles per hour and a pressure of 937 millibars. After it made landfall, Harvey stalled as it dumped treacherous amounts of rainfall along the coast of Texas and inland Texas, and it slowly crossed into the Gulf of Mexico once again, regenerated into a tropical storm, and then made landfall in, I think, southwestern Louisiana. Harvey is also tied as the costliest hurricane on record, with Hurricane Katrina in 2005, I think, of $125 billion, I think. And I definitely remember that time when Harvey made landfall and when it dumped treacherous amounts of rainfall. My cul-de-sac was like flooded, and it was like right onto my driveway, and yeah, it was definitely awful, and I will never forget that storm.
The Force 13 broadcast team also covered the storm in the run-up to landfall. Force 13's live coverage of Hurricane Harvey begins right now at 6 p.m. UTC on August 24th. It's got winds of 85 miles an hour, a pressure of 979 millibars, and that pressure is decreasing as the day wears on and the storm continues to intensify as it continues towards the northwest. Hurricane warnings, as you know, are in effect in abundance.
I've been in shock near enough all day. We're just watching this thing blow up very, very rapidly and drop pretty much 20 millibars in 6 hours since the night before Recon started going in and finding tropical storm force winds in Harvey.
You know, it's something to behold that such a hurricane at this has pretty much defied all expectations of it. It's pretty much bent the boundaries.
Yeah, this is honestly a very scary situation, especially for anybody that had decided to stay on the coastline and ride this thing out. Hopefully none of the viewers are one of those people, but if you are, get ready to hunker down.
Harvey is also tied for the fourth strongest hurricane landfall along the coast of Texas. Whilst its damage total is not yet known, it is at least the third costliest storm in United States history. Harvey became the harbinger of what would become the 2017 Atlantic hurricane season. Of course, at the time that it happened, it was seen as a massive thing in and of itself. That is, of course, for the short period of time, just about a week or so before Irma arrived the following week. The whole season is really an anomaly, as we know, but Harvey's impact was certainly one of the worst on US soil and anywhere in the basin that year. A different kind of disaster to Irma, because Harvey's main problems were the flooding, where Irma was really the winds. Harvey's flooding expanded over extremely large populations, of course the greater Houston area involved, and it caused at least $108 billion in damages after it made landfall as a 140 mile per hour Category 4 storm. It caused at least 108 fatalities, damaged 185,000 buildings and destroyed at least 9,000. Over 500,000 evacuated from the storm. But its rainfall total is certainly one that really raises the eyebrows. 1,539 millimeters, which is an extraordinary amount. I think that's over 60 inches. So Harvey, of course, will be remembered for a variety of reasons, particularly in Texas. Its erratic track, its unexpected intensification in the western Gulf. No one saw that coming when it originally died out as a tropical cyclone in the Caribbean Sea. But there it was, Harvey, rightfully number 3 in my top 100. Kushimoto, Japan, September 1959. A tropical disturbance eventually developed into a tropical cyclone to the east of the Mariana Islands, quickly becoming Tropical Storm Vera. It rapidly intensified into a powerful Category 5 storm as it moved northwestwards and then curved northwards, making a beeline for the coast of Japan. Making landfall in the central part of Honshu, it continued northeastwards, ploughing through as a major typhoon and then curving back out to sea and turning post-tropical. Well, quite a simple animation there, but Typhoon Vera's impacts were a lot more dramatic than a simple animation can show. It was mainly the extraordinary storm surge that ploughed into the coast of Japan. It was weakening by the time it made landfall. Some suggest that it was a Category 5 at landfall, and that's the line from the JTWC. Although land observations suggest that it was actually quite a bit weaker by the time it actually made landfall. Probably a borderline Category 3-4. Nonetheless, the storm surge is definitely characteristic of a Category 5 storm, because storms don't just lose that power straight away, and so the coast was battered by the dreadful surge, which destroyed flood defences and then ran amok inland. The amount of area that was flooded and saturated by that storm surge was quite enormous, and buildings were damaged and flattened for miles around. In the early days, of course, helicopters were the best way to get around to take a look and survey the damage, and also to provide rescue for those who were struggling on the ground. Bridges were washed out and makeshift bridges were built in a matter of days out of anything people could get their hands on, usually wooden planks. And the flooding areas were, as you can see here, extremely large in area. Lots of rainfall occurred inland as well, causing flooding and landslides there. One such landslide occurring slightly inland from where the storm made landfall and killed 60, so it wasn't just along the coast. Well, apparently this storm was well forecasted, and I believe this was one of the first ever storms to actually have primitive model forecastings, computer estimates, and despite its good forecasting, it was apparently not taken seriously enough locally in the media and with people in general, and as such it was an extremely deadly impacting storm, one of the deadliest storms to strike Japan. Of course, it was given a special Japanese name, one of only a handful of storms to be given one, the Isiwan Typhoon, and that is a name that most people there remember it by. The scope of the disaster was quite astronomical. 5,098 were killed by Typhoon Vera. $600 million in damages resulting from this storm as well, which peaked at 180 miles per hour and a pressure of 894 millibars early on in its Category 5 phase, and it gradually weakened as it got closer to shore. It damaged 371,000 buildings, destroyed 834,000, and injured an extraordinary 39,000 people. It also produced up to 318 millimeters of rainfall when it arrived. My estimate for landfall is 140 miles per hour and a pressure of 929. It's the best estimate, I think, although, as mentioned, some agencies still have it as a Category 5. Well, long after the storm was in the area, the effects continued to be felt. The flooding persisted for day after day after day. 6 days after the disaster, the flooding was still extreme in some of these locations. 11 days, not much had changed by this point either. 36 days, that's over a month, and the flooding was still prevalent in some locations. And finally, into December, 58 days after the storm made landfall, some areas looked like they'd just been impacted the day before. So why is Vera number 2 in my top 100 when some may think it should be lower perhaps? Well, it was extremely powerful at peak, up to a very high latitude, one of the most strongest landfalls in the central part of Japan. Its death toll was astronomical, the buildings damaged and destroyed were immense, the damages in monetary value back then in 1959 were up in the towards the higher end of what you would expect, and so I think this storm is an all-round beast, and I think that's why it ended up being number 2 in my top 100. Tacloban, Philippines, November 2013. A tropical disturbance became a depression and then a tropical storm as it moved through the Micronesian islands, becoming Typhoon Haiyan as it continued westwards towards Palau, where it caused a fair amount of damage. It became a Category 5 and then barreled towards the Philippine Islands, making its extraordinarily powerful landfall, which we all know about. It was a big decision to put Haiyan at number 1 in my top 100, but based on all of the things put together, the size of the storm, how it really came out of nowhere almost. I mean, we've had low latitude monsters before, but this one was really on a completely different scale that we hadn't seen before when we first saw it happen. It was a monumental disaster for the Philippines, which caused the highest death toll in the country in modern times. It's believed that only the Haipong typhoon killed more, although there is a possibility that some others in earlier centuries may have killed actually more than this storm. But nonetheless, its modern death toll is the highest in Philippine history, and the damage was absolutely extraordinary in the areas that were impacted. First in Guian on the southern tip of Samar, and then onto northern Leyte where it struck Tacloban and then continued westwards through the rest of the Visayas region, and still a Category 4 by the time it emerged on the other side of the Philippines into the South China Sea. It dragged along with it an immense amount of power, with wind speed estimates up to 200 miles per hour near its landfall, probably weakening just slightly before it actually struck land, and an estimated central pressure by my estimates of 879 millibars, which would put it certainly in the top 1%. Probably one of the most powerful landfalling storms as well, one of the most powerful storms at landfall, that should be said. It was stronger than Meggy, which was 885 at landfall, and I would say it's probably stronger than almost anything else in the world, really. I can't think of anything that beats it. Haiyan, when it continued westwards, it was moving at a decent speed. Storm surge, of course, being a massive problem from this storm, which was exacerbated by the movement, which was a little bit faster than your typical tropical cyclone. In total, this storm caused $2.8 billion in damages. It's believed to have killed 7,401. The amount of buildings damaged, 572,000, destroyed 536,000, making it one of the most destructive storms in Philippine history. Additionally, around 800,000 evacuated from the storm before it arrived, and rainfall amounts weren't the highest. I think we're talking something like 200 to 300 millimeters in some parts of the Philippines. It may have been higher than that, but certainly the rainfall factor wasn't the biggest from this storm. It was its immense colossal winds that struck the coastline, and the scars were left for years afterwards, and probably still not even to this day. Of course, this area is fairly susceptible to typhoons, but at this strength and level, I don't think anyone can really prepare for a storm like Haiyan, and that's why it's number 1 in my top 100.